They watched her bleed and did nothing. That's what I remember most about Three Cedars. Not the dry wind, not the prayerless church, not even the girl with the busted lip and broken pride. No, what stays with me is the silence of that town when Ella hit the ground. They let it happen because she was part Cherokee, part ghost, and all alone. But fate doesn't always leave its mark with bullets or fire. Sometimes it walks in barefoot, steady and quiet, wrapped in a buffalo hide, with a voice like stone and hands that know both war and mercy. His name was Taza. What do you think? Did Ella survive that fall, or was she reborn in the dust? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's ride this story together. Let's see how it all went down. The town of Three Cedars huddled under a wide, indifferent sky, its buildings bleached by a sun that seemed to offer illumination without warmth. Dust, fine as ground bone, settled over everything. The warped boards of the saloon, the imposing facade of the new courthouse, and the steepled church that cast a long, judgmental shadow every afternoon. Three Cedars prided itself on its unyielding morality, a veneer as thin and brittle as winter ice over a dark, turbulent river. Beneath it lay a current of arid judgment, of casual brutality, where difference was a sin and mercy a forgotten word. Ella lived in the town's parched margins, in a small, weathered cabin at the edge of the creek where the willows grew sparse. She was of the Cherokee, her mother's blood running strong in her high cheekbones and the obsidian sheen of her long, dark hair, a heritage that Three Cedars regarded as a stain. She moved through the town like a phantom, enduring the averted gazes, the muttered scorn, the chilling righteousness of folk who believed their God favored only their own kind. One sweltering afternoon, the kind where heat devils danced on the plains and tempers frayed like old rope, Ella was in the dusty main street, her worn basket on her arm. She'd been trading a few carefully snared rabbits for flour and thread. Judge Thorne, a man whose piety was as pronounced as his paunch, and whose power in Three Cedars was nearly absolute, strode from the mercantile. He'd made advances before, veiled threats wrapped in scripture, all of which Ella had silently rebuffed. Today, perhaps emboldened by the heat or a perceived slight in her quiet dignity, his malice broke its leash. "You there, half-breed," he boomed, his voice a whip crack in the oppressive air. An accusation followed, something about stolen goods. A lie so blatant it choked the air. Before Ella could even register the words, his heavy hand struck her face, sending her reeling. The basket scattered its meager contents. He struck her again, and she fell to her knees in the dust. The town watching, silent, complicit. Some wore expressions of grim satisfaction. This was order, as they understood it. Then, a shadow fell. A man stepped from the alleyway beside the blacksmith's shop, moving with a quiet, lethal grace that made the heat itself seem to pause. He was tall, lean-muscled, his skin the color of weathered leather. His black hair was tied back with a simple thong, and his eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed on Judge Thorne. He was a stranger to most. A man known only as Taza, who had drifted into town a few weeks prior, keeping to himself, his origins a subject of wary speculation. Taza didn't speak. He simply moved, deflecting Thorne's next blow aimed at the fallen Ella, and then delivered a single, precise strike to the judge's jaw. The sound was like dry wood snapping. Judge Thorne crumpled, a stunned, ungainly heap in the dirt he so readily dealt to others. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Taza ignored them. He bent, gently helping Ella to her feet. His touch surprisingly steady. He retrieved her scattered belongings, his movements unhurried. Then, with a hand lightly on her elbow, he guided her away from the gawking crowd. Down the street and towards the path that led to her cabin, he didn't speak a word to her, nor she to him. They left behind them a town boiling with a scandal that would be savored and dissected for weeks to come. The outcast woman, the fallen pillar of society, and the enigmatic stranger who had dared to defy the established order. In the days that followed, a silent understanding began to weave itself between Ella and Taza. He never came to her cabin, nor she to wherever he found shelter, but in the unforgiving landscape of Three Cedars, their paths would cross, a brief meeting of eyes across the dusty expanse of the general store, a shared moment of stillness as they both paused by the creek. Sometimes, it was merely the awareness of his presence nearby, a silent sentinel whose gaze she would feel, not as a threat, but as something else, something she couldn't yet name. These were their hushed communion, whispers without words in a town that only offered loud condemnation. The townsfolk whispered too, their words laced with malice and suspicion, linking Ella and Taza in a narrative of shared transgression. The fragile peace, if it could be called that, shattered on a bitter Sunday morning, snow spitting from a leaden sky. Ella had gone to the church, a small, desperate act of faith, or perhaps defiance, hoping for a sliver of solace, a moment's respite from the town's unceasing hostility. She hadn't counted on Judge Thorne, his face still bruised, his eyes burning with a vindictive rage, preaching from the pulpit about impurity and the need to scourge sin from their midst. His sermon was aimed directly at her. When the service ended, as the congregation filed out, their faces masks of cold piety, a group of Thorne's most ardent supporters, men emboldened by their judge's rhetoric and their own righteous cruelty, cornered Ella near the church doors. The first blow was to her spirit, a torrent of vile accusations. The physical blows followed swiftly. This time, Taza was not there. Ella stumbled from the churchyard, her lip split, her cheekbone aching, a fresh stain of crimson blooming on the pristine snow. The pain was a familiar companion, but today it was accompanied by a desolation so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. She didn't return to her cabin. Instead, she walked, her steps mechanical, towards the desolate bluffs that overlooked the frozen, barren expanse known locally as the Devil's Hollow, a place of stark, empty chasms and wind-scoured rock. It was a void reflecting the emptiness within her. She sank to her knees at the edge of a precipice, the wind tearing at her hair, the snow stinging her face, a keening sound trapped in her throat. She didn't know how long she knelt there, teetering on the edge of oblivion, before she felt a presence behind her. She didn't need to turn. She knew. Taza's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and strong through her thin shawl. He said nothing, simply knelt beside her, his body a shield against the biting wind. He looked out at the bleak expanse. Then his gaze returned to her, and in his dark eyes, she saw not pity, but a fierce, profound understanding, a shared recognition of pain and resilience. After a long moment, he rose, and with infinite gentleness, lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light. Her blood stained his worn buckskin shirt, a mirror of the snow she'd left behind at the church. He held her close, his stride sure and steady as he turned his back on the Devil's Hollow and began the long walk away from Three Cedars. He didn't look back. Idja, cradled against his strength, closed her eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the dust and blood on her cheek. Abandoned by a town that preached salvation but practiced cruelty, she was being carried towards an unknown horizon, rescued by a silent man who understood, better than any other, the language of the heart. He carried her for miles, the bleak landscape of their flight gradually softening as they moved further from the bitter memory of Three Cedars. They followed no discernible trail. Taza navigating by an instinct Ella didn't question, his long, steady strides eating up the miles. When she finally stirred, protesting weakly that she could walk, he set her down gently, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress. Her body ached. Her spirit felt bruised candidatos the core, but the raw edge of despair had receded, replaced by a fragile, tentative trust in the silent man beside her. They made camp that first night in a shallow, sheltered dress, a sliver of moon offering scant light. Taza built a small, smokeless fire with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. He cleaned her wounds again with water from his canteen and an infusion of herbs he gathered nearby, his touch impersonal yet profoundly gentle. They ate sparingly, dried meat and hardtack from his saddlebags. The silence between them was vast, but no longer empty. It was a silence that listened, that understood. It was 2 nights later, under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed to crackle in the cold, clear air, that Taza finally spoke of himself. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting flickering shadows on their faces. "My sister," he began, his voice low, rough as weathered stone. Her name was Little Dove. He stared into the dying fire, his gaze fixed on a past Ella could only imagine. She was, like you, caught between worlds. Her mother was Apache, her father, white. He left, like they do. He paused, the silence stretching, filled only by the sigh of the wind through the sparse prairie grass. There were men, from a settlement not unlike Three Cedars. They didn't like her spirit, didn't like her eyes looking back at them. Unafraid, his hand clenched, the knuckles white in the firelight. They called her Na-Lin-A. He said the word softly, bitterly. It means not enough. Not enough Apache to be one of them. Not enough white to be one of them. Belonging to no one. His voice choked slightly. They beat her. For sport. For being what she was. He looked at Ella then, his dark eyes pools of remembered pain. She didn't survive their righteousness. The stark, brutal honesty of his story settled over Ella. A shared weight. She saw the source of his quiet fury in Three Cedars, the root of his immediate, unwavering protection of her. He had seen his sister in her. Tears welled in Ella's eyes, not for herself this time, but for Little Dove, and for the silent, grieving man beside her. She reached out a hesitant hand, laying it briefly on his arm, a small gesture, but it conveyed a depth of understanding that words could not. Later, as the embers faded to gray ash, it was Ella's turn. The safety of his shared sorrow unlocked her own. "My mother was Cherokee," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She loved a traitor, a white man. He gave her promises, then he gave her me, and then he vanished. My mother's people. They couldn't forgive her for loving him, or for my face, which was a reminder. She looked down at her hands. She left me at a mission when I was small, said it was for my own good, a better life. A humorless smile touched her lips. The mission taught me their God, but not their acceptance, and the towns, like three cedars. They only saw the part of me that wasn't like them, the part they feared or despised. She finally met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a lifetime of unspoken hurt. To be seen, truly seen, and not judged. I didn't know if such a thing was possible. Taza listened, his expression unchanging, yet she felt his attention, his empathy, like a tangible warmth. There was no pity in his eyes, only a profound recognition they were two solitary souls, marked by their origins, scarred by the world's cruelty, who had found in each other a mirror to their own pain, and perhaps a balm for it. There was no wallowing in their grief, no descent into bitterness. Instead, a quiet strength began to emerge, forged in the crucible of shared understanding. As they journeyed on, seeking a place where the shadows of the past might not reach so readily, Taza began to teach her. He showed her how to read the subtle language of the land. The track of a deer, the turn of a leaf that signaled water, the distant call of a hawk. He taught her how to build a fire that left no trace, how to set a snare, how to tan the hide of a rabbit until it was soft and pliable. She learned to move with a new quietness, her senses sharpened, her body growing stronger, more resilient. It was a silent companionship, their days measured by the rhythm of travel, their evenings by the glow of the fire and the slow, careful unfolding of their stories, their trust. Weeks later, they came upon a small, dusty settlement nestled in a shallow valley, a cluster of rough-hewn buildings that seemed less sure of its own righteousness than three cedars. They needed supplies. Taza had managed to trade a few well-cured pelts for coin in a solitary trapper's camp they'd passed. "I need to get some things," Ella said one morning, looking towards the settlement. "Some flour, salt, maybe some lumber, if they have it, for a lean-to, a more permanent shelter." The thought of building something, however small, with her own hands, alongside Taza, felt like a step towards a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Taza nodded. "Be watchful." It was all he said, but his eyes conveyed the rest. His trust in her, his unwavering, silent support. Ella walked into the settlement alone, her heart beating a little faster. The main street was short, a few stores, a livery, a saloon already emitting sounds of raucous laughter despite the early hour. As she entered the mercantile, conversations quieted. Eyes followed her, curious, wary. She felt the familiar prickle of being an outsider, the subtle shift in the air that always accompanied her presence. But here, the stares were less overtly hostile than in Three Cedars, more guarded than cruel. She made her purchases: flour, salt, a sturdy axe head, and inquired about lumber. The storekeeper, a portly man with tired eyes, directed her to a small mill at the edge of town. There, too, she felt the weight of unspoken judgment as she selected a few rough planks. Men paused in their work, their gazes lingering. No one spoke to her directly, but she heard a muttered comment, a low chuckle. She kept her expression neutral, paid for her wood, and walked away. Her head held high. The hurt was still there, a dull ache, but it no longer had the power to cripple her. She knew who she was now, not by the reflections in their eyes, but by the quiet strength Taza had helped her find within herself. As she walked back towards the camp they had made outside of town, she knew he would be waiting, his presence a silent affirmation that she was not, after all, alone. The seasons turned. each one etching a deeper sense of permanence into the small homestead Ella and Taza had carved from the wilderness. The lean-to, built with the lumber Ella had bought, and Taza's patient skill, had become a snug cabin, its single room filled with the scent of wood smoke, drying herbs, and tan and hides. A sturdy horse stall stood nearby, testament to Taza's handiwork. Young saplings, carefully transplanted from the creek bed, offered a promise of future shade around their dwelling. They had tilled a small patch of earth where vegetables grew, a defiant splash of green against the muted tones of the prairie. It was a quiet life, a life lived on the fringes, but it was theirs, built with shared labor and unspoken understanding. The fragile peace was shattered one crisp autumn afternoon by the arrival of a circuit rider, a lean, weathered man of God who also carried news and mail to the scattered homesteads. He accepted their hospitality of water and a little jerky, and then, with a troubled look, he unfolded a creased handbill. It was a wanted poster, crude but clear enough. The name was Taza, though no surname was given. The description was general, tall, dark-haired, of mixed blood, but the likeness, however poorly drawn, was unmistakable. The charge was murder, years ago, in a territory further south. The accuser, the handbill stated, was unnamed, their testimony sealed. A cold dread seeped into Ella's heart, more chilling than any winter wind. She looked at Taza. His face was unreadable, carved from stone, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a flicker of ancient pain, the shadow of a past he rarely spoke of, but which clearly still haunted him. The circuit rider, sensing the tension, coughed uneasily. "Just doing my duty, delivering the mail and official notices," he mumbled, before making a hasty departure, leaving the handbill and a heavy silence in his wake. When he was gone, Ella turned to Taza, her fear warring with a fierce, protective anger. "This is a lie," she stated, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "Some ghost from a past you haven't told me. Or worse, a shadow cast by men like Thorn. Reaching out even here." Taza picked up the handbill, his gaze lingering on the crude drawing. "There was trouble," he said, his voice low. "A long time ago, after my sister, Little Dove. I sought out the men who hurt her. There was a reckoning." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The stark admission hung in the air. Justice, in his world, had been a raw, personal thing. That was justice. Taza, not murder, Ella insisted, her mind racing. "This anonymous accuser, it's a coward's way. We can fight this." She began to pace their small cabin, her earlier trepidation giving way to a steely resolve. "They don't know you, not the man you are now." Her voice gained strength. "Who is this man they hunt? Is he the one who built this roof over our heads with his own hands? The one who coaxed those saplings to take root in stubborn soil? The one who shared his last strip of jerky when rations were low on our journey? The one who patiently taught a broken woman how to make fire, how to read the signs of the earth, how to stand on her own feet again?" Her eyes flashed. "The man described on that paper is a phantom. The man who lives here, who built this life beside me. He is real. That is the truth they need to see." Taza watched her, a flicker of something akin to wonder in his stoic gaze. He had seen her resilience before, her quiet courage, but this fierce advocacy, this intelligent fire, was new. It was the strength of a woman defending her home, her partner. "They will come for me," he said, his voice flat. "Lawmen. Then we prepare for them. Ella declared, "We don't run. You said it yourself. Taza, when we first started building here, when I was still afraid of every shadow we build. Ija, we don't run." She met his gaze, unwavering. Those words meant something. They still do. His decision was made in the quiet depth of his eyes. A slow nod. We stay. The days that followed were filled with a tense, purposeful energy. Ella, armed with a fierce determination, sought out the few souls scattered in the surrounding wilderness with whom they'd had fleeting, mostly cautious, contact. There was old Jedediah, a reclusive trapper downriver, with whom Taza had traded pelts and shared a pipe on rare occasions. There was the quiet homesteader family, the Millers, miles to the east, whose young son Taza had helped find when he'd wandered off during a summer storm. Ella spoke to them, her words simple, direct, asking not for judgment of Taza's past, but for testimony of the man they had seen. His quiet industry, his willingness to lend a hand, his peaceful existence. She gathered their words, their hesitant acknowledgments of Taza's character, like precious, scattered stones. She meticulously wrote down Taza's own sparse account of his life since leaving his old territories, a timeline of quiet labor and solitude until he found her. They waited. The rhythm of their days continued, tending their small garden, hunting for meat, reinforcing the cabin against the coming winter. But beneath it all was a taut awareness, a listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They came on a cold, gray morning, 3 riders silhouetted against the pale sky. U.S. Marshals. Their faces were grim, their eyes observant, their movements professional. They dismounted. Their leader, a tall man with a weary, weathered face, approaching the cabin. "Taza?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. Taza stepped forward. "I am Taza." Ella moved to stand beside him, her small frame radiating a surprising authority. "And I am Ella. This is our home." The lead marshal looked from Taza to Ella, then around at the small, well-tended homestead, the neat cabin, the sturdy stall, the rows of harvested vegetables, the carefully banked fire. He held the wanted poster in his hand. "There's a warrant for your arrest. Tadzat, murder, from the Oklahoma Territory. An old charge, but it's been reactivated." An anonymous witness came forward. Ella stepped forward, holding out the few carefully written pages she had prepared. Her own testimony, the statements from Jedediah and the Millers, her timeline of Taza's life as she knew it. "Marshal," she said, her voice clear and steady, "the man described on that paper is not the man who stands before you. This man is a builder, not a destroyer. He has harmed no one in this valley. He has offered help and asked for nothing. These papers speak of the man we know." The marshal took the papers, his eyebrows raising slightly at Ella's articulate defense. He read them slowly, carefully, his gaze occasionally flicking up to assess Taza, who stood silent, watchful, then to Ella, whose chin was high, her eyes unwavering. His companions waited, their expressions unreadable, the silence stretched, thick with unspoken possibilities. The marshal folded Ella's papers. He looked at Taza for a long moment. "This warrant," he said finally, his voice thoughtful, "it's based on an old incident and a new, unnamed accuser. Your past may yet catch up to you, Taza. But what I see here," he gestured to their homestead, to Ella's carefully penned words. "Lasukser is a man trying to live a quiet life, and this new evidence against you is thin." almost transparent. He sighed, a weary sound. For now, there's not enough here to compel me to drag you halfway across the territories on the word of a ghost. Not when there are fresh crimes needing attention. He fixed Taza with a hard look. But stay clean. Don't give anyone a reason to look your way again. He nodded curtly to Ella, then to his men. We ride. They mounted and left, their departure as swift as their arrival. Ella and Taza stood side by side, watching until they were small figures in the distance. The immediate threat had passed. A profound relief washed over Ella, though she knew this was a reprieve, not a full pardon. The shadow of Taza's past and the malice of those who wished him ill still lingered. But today, they had stood their ground. Together, they had chosen to build, not to run, and for now, that had been enough. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The departure of the marshals left a profound stillness in its wake, the kind that follows a storm when the air is washed clean and the world seems to hold its breath. The immediate threat had passed, but its shadow lingered, a reminder of the fragility of their peace. Yet, in that shared crucible of fear and defiance, something had irrevocably shifted between Ella and Taza. Their bond, forged in shared pain and silent understanding, had been tempered into an unbreakable strength. In the weeks that followed, Ella found herself walking into the small settlement nearby with a newfound steadiness in her step. Her head was held high, not in challenge, but in the quiet assertion of her right to be there. She bought seeds, cloth, more lumber, nails, the tangible materials of a future they were determined to build. At first, the averted gazes and hushed conversations still followed her, but the edge of hostility had softened, replaced by a grudging curiosity, perhaps even a nascent respect for the woman who had stood beside her man and faced down the law. Taza rarely accompanied her on these trips, preferring the solitude of their homestead, but his presence was a constant anchor in her heart. Together, they worked, the rhythm of their days a quiet testament to their shared purpose. Taza, with his patient skill, expanded their small cabin, adding a sleeping alcove that offered a measure of privacy. He built sturdy fences around Ella's burgeoning garden and a small corral for the wild mustang he had patiently gentled. Ija, in turn, cultivated her vegetables with a loving hand, sewed them warm clothes from traded wool and supple deer hide, and filled their small home with the scent of herbs and baking bread. Evenings were spent by the fire, the silence comfortable, companionable. Sometimes, Ella would speak of the stories her Cherokee mother had told her as a child, tales of the spirits of the land, of resilience, of the interconnectedness of all things. Taza would listen, his dark eyes thoughtful, occasionally adding a word or a memory from his own Apache traditions, weaving their separate pasts into a shared tapestry of heritage. He taught her more of the old ways, how to listen to the wind, how to find medicine in the wild plants, how to move through the world with a reverence for its hidden life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ice around them in the nearby settlement began to thaw. A hesitant nod from a storekeeper, a gruff but not unkind word from a farmer whose wagon wheel Taza had helped mend on the trail. One afternoon, Mrs. Miller, the homesteader whose son Taza had found, approached Ella in the mercantile, pressing a small jar of apple preserves into her hand. "For your trouble," she'd mumbled, Her face flushed, but her eyes kind, and, "We're sorry for not being neighborlier sooner." It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The community, witnessing their quiet industry, their resilience, and the unwavering dignity with which they faced their hardships, was beginning to see them not as outcasts, but as people striving for a life, much like themselves. One day, Sheriff Dalton, the lawman for their small valley, rode out to their homestead. He was a fair man, younger than the marshal who had come before, his eyes holding a measure of weariness, but also a straightforward honesty. Ella and Taza met him outside their cabin, a quiet apprehension settling over them. Sheriff Dalton dismounted, removing his hat. "Morning, Ija, Taza," he said, his gaze respectful. "Came to see how you were faring." He looked around at their neat, thriving homestead. "You've done good work here, carved out a life." He paused, then met their eyes directly. "Heard about what happened with those marshals, and I've heard folks in town talkin'. Some of it not kind, but more and more, folks are seeing the truth of who you are." He shifted his weight. "This territory, it's seen its share of wrongs. My father's generation, they made mistakes, held on to prejudices that caused a lot of pain. Sometimes, the law itself got twisted by fear and ignorance." He looked at Taza. "What happened to you? The way you've been hounded, it ain't right. A man deserves a chance to live in peace, to be judged by his actions here and now, not by whispers from a shadowed past or the color of his skin." It wasn't an apology for the whole world's ills, but it was an acknowledgement, a hand extended across a divide that had seemed, for so long, impassable. It was a promise of a fairer peace in this small corner of the world. The following spring, during a bustling market day in a larger town a day's ride away, a place where people from all walks of life converged to trade goods and news, Taza led Ella through the noisy, colorful throng. She had been admiring a display of vibrant woven blankets when he gently took her hand. He led her to a slightly quieter spot, near a stand selling seeds and wildflowers. He didn't speak. Words were often an encumbrance for Taza, his deepest feelings conveyed through action, through the unwavering intensity of his gaze. From a small leather pouch at his belt, he drew out a simple, finely braided leather cord. Tied to it was a single, perfect hawk feather, a feather that spoke of vision, of strength, of the soaring spirit of his Apache ancestors. He held it out to her, his dark eyes searching hers, asking a question that needed no voice. Ella's breath caught. This was no store-bought ring, no conventional vow. This was Taza, offering her a bond as strong and true as the leather, as sacred as the feather, a promise rooted in the earth they shared, and the sky under which they had found each other. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming joy. She reached out and took the cord, her fingers closing over his. Her answer was in the radiant smile that transformed her face, in the way she leaned into his strength, her head resting against his shoulder, there amidst the cacophony of the market. Two solitary souls who had found their harbor, their home, in each other. The world around them faded. There was only the feel of the braided leather, the silent promise of the feather, and the enduring truth of a love that had weathered the harshest storms and emerged, quiet and unbreakable, into the light. The years that followed Taza's silent proposal in the bustling marketplace unfolded like the slow, deliberate turning of the seasons, each one layering their lives with a deeper richness, a more profound sense of belonging. Their small homestead, once a fragile outpost against the wilderness, took firm root, its heart the growing cabin, now expanded by Taza's patient hands into 3 sturdy rooms that offered shelter, warmth, and the quiet hum of a shared life. Ella's belly swelled with new life, a tangible promise of their future. When her time came, Taza was her rock, his quiet strength her anchor through the storm of childbirth. Their daughter was born as the first wildflowers of spring painted the prairie. A tiny, perfect being with Ella's determined chin and Taza's luminous, dark eyes, they named her Willa, a name that spoke of willows and resilience, and, in a quiet ceremony by their hearth, Taza gave her a name from his Apache mother's people, Whispering Wind, for the spirit that moves unseen but shapes the land, while Ella bestowed upon her a Cherokee name, Aryoka, meaning she who brings happiness, a name that had belonged to her own grandmother. Willa, Whispering Wind, Ahyoka, a child of 2 peoples, a symbol of their interwoven heritage, a testament to a love that transcended old boundaries. As Willa grew, so did Ella and Taza's vision for a different kind of future. They had seen the hardship faced by children like themselves, caught between worlds, often shunned and denied opportunity. With the help of Sheriff Dalton, who had become a quiet supporter, and a few of the more open-hearted townsfolk like the Millers, they built a small, 1-room schoolhouse not far from their homestead. It wasn't much, rough-hewn planks and a pot-bellied stove, but to the handful of mixed-blood children and those from the poorest homesteader families who gathered there, it was a sanctuary. Ella, drawing on the mission schooling she had once resented, taught them reading, writing, and numbers, while Taza shared his knowledge of the land, of the old ways of tracking, hunting, and respecting the natural world. It was a small seed of change planted in stubborn soil. One spring, Taza led Ella and a young Willa to a barren, wind-scoured patch of land miles from their home, a place that reminded Ella of the desolation she had once felt near the Devil's Hollow. It was, Taza explained, a place where his own people had once been driven from, a place of sorrow. Together, they planted young cedar saplings, trees of resilience and ancient memory, around each fledgling tree. Ella tied a bright red cloth ribbon, a splash of vibrant color against the somber earth, a prayer for healing, a symbol of reconciliation with the land, with their pasts, and with the hope for a future where such desolation would not hold sway. But the past, as Taza knew too well, had long shadows. One late summer afternoon, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, a group of riders appeared. They were hard-faced men, old hunters. Taza called them, their eyes cold, their guns worn with familiarity. Some among them, Ella recognized with a jolt of fear, bore a resemblance to the kind of men who had attacked Taza's sister, perhaps even connected to the anonymous accusation that had brought the marshals. They were remnants of an older, more brutal time, men who saw the world only in terms of predator and prey, who despised the peace Taza and Ella had painstakingly built. They rode not to the isolated homestead, but into the nearby settlement, their presence an immediate, palpable threat. Word reached Ella and Taza quickly, carried by a breathless young Miller boy. This time, however, they were not alone. As Taza and Ella rode towards the town, their faces grim but resolute, they saw figures emerging from homesteads, from the small shops. Sheriff Dalton, his hand resting on his Colt, the Millers armed with their old farm rifle, Jedediah the trapper, his long Kentucky rifle glinting. Even the once hesitant storekeeper, one by one. Then, in small groups, the townspeople stood silently in the main street, not behind Ella and Taza, but beside them, forming a quiet, unyielding wall. The old hunters, faced not with two isolated outcasts, but with an entire community united in quiet defiance, saw their anticipated power crumble. There were no shouts, no drawn guns from the townsfolk, just a profound, collective stillness that spoke louder than any threat. After a tense, charged standoff, the hunters, muttering curses, turned their horses and rode away, their menace dissolving into the dust. The town had found its voice, its courage. It was a quiet victory, but a profound one, signifying a genuine rebirth of spirit. In the peaceful years that followed, as Willa grew from a curious child into a thoughtful young woman, Ella began to write. She filled journals with their story. The pain of 3 cedars, the silent journey with Taza, the building of their life, the wisdom of her Cherokee mother, the strength of Taza's Apache heritage, she wrote for Willa, so that their daughter would know the full measure of her origins, the sacrifices made, the love that had been their foundation. These writings, bound in supple deer hide Taza had prepared, hung from a peg in their 3-room home, a testament to their journey. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, Ella would look around their home. At Taza, his face softer now with the peace of years, though his eyes still held their watchful depth. At Willa, her dark hair braided with beads, reading by the firelight, a living embodiment of their hopes, and she would see, tucked into a small clay pot on the windowsill where Willa had placed it, one of the red ribbons from the cedar saplings they had planted long ago. It was faded now, softened by time, but when the prairie wind stirred, it would lift and dance, a small, bright flicker of color in their peaceful home, a silent, enduring promise of hope, a legacy of love and resilience whispered on the wind, a benediction that would last forever. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the wind on the canyon ridge or heard Ella's silence break, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment hit hardest? What would you have done? Leave a comment below. And if you want more stories like this, where the dust doesn't just settle, it speaks, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next ride. Because out here, every story leaves a trail.